You know the feeling. You're standing in the aisle looking at two basically identical products, and your brain instantly screams at you to grab the one with the lowest price tag. It feels like a total win, right? But here's the thing. Picking the absolute cheapest option is not always the smartest financial move. Actually, it can completely backfire. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into exactly why being cheap might actually be draining your wallet in the long run. I really want you to ask yourself this. Is the absolute cheapest option actually costing you more? We're all basically trained to hunt for bargains, but we really need to stop and ask if those quick, immediate savings are actually hiding massive, long-term hidden costs. Because honestly, the price tag rarely tells the whole story. There's actually a great economic term for this trap. It's called a false economy. Basically, a false economy happens when you buy a cheaper product, but it just doesn't last, it breaks down, it needs constant fixing, and ultimately it traps you in this awful cycle of spending where you end up paying way more over time than if you just ponied up for the quality item in the first place. All right, let's get into section 1, the quality trap. Let's look at a real-world example of how buying poor quality forces you to just buy the exact same thing over and over. This brilliantly illustrates the famous boots theory by the writer Terry Pratchett. So imagine you buy a cheap pair of work boots for $10. They're kind of okay for a season, right? But then the cheap cardboard sole gives out and they start leaking, so you have to buy a new pair every single year. Now, compare that to a solid, quality pair of leather boots for $50. These things are built like a tank. They keep your feet bone dry, and they easily last for 10 solid years. So here's where the math gets brutal. Over 10 years, the person who kept buying those cheap $10 boots spends a total of $100. They literally spent double what the quality boots cost. And honestly, the worst part? Even after spending twice as much money, the guy buying the cheap boots still spent most of that decade walking around with wet feet. That is the harsh reality of buying cheap and buying twice. Moving on to section 2, cutting corners on big decisions. This quality trap doesn't just apply to things like footwear. When we default to the absolute cheapest option on major decisions, the costs can be totally catastrophic. Take deferred maintenance, for example. Step 1, you skip a quick, cheap oil change just to save a few bucks today. Step 2, without that clean oil, your engine's internal parts start grinding and wearing down way too fast. And then, step 3, bam, you suffer a massive engine failure. By trying to save maybe $50 up front, you literally just caused thousands of dollars in damage. And man, this concept applies heavily to credit and debt too. Let's say you have a totally unexpected $400 emergency. If you take out a cheap, easy-to-get payday loan, you're going to pay around $120 in fees for just a standard 2-week period. That annualizes to a staggering 391% APR. But compare that to someone using a standard credit card at, say, 20% APR, they pay about $17 in interest. The exact same emergency costs one person a massive fraction of what it costs the other. This whole systemic issue is actually called the poverty premium. Data out of the UK shows that this penalty costs low-income households an average of almost 500 extra pounds every single year. And this penalty is literally everywhere. It impacts your car insurance rates based on your zip code. It impacts your utility bills. People just end up paying more simply because they can't afford that upfront cost of the better long-term option. This brings us to section 3, cost per use thinking. So how do we actually break free from this price tag trap? Well, enter the concept of cost per use. This is a super simple way to evaluate a purchase based on its total lifetime value instead of just the upfront price. You calculate things like operating costs, routine maintenance, and simply how long the thing is going to last. In the business world, they call this the total cost of ownership. Think of that initial sticker price as just the tip of the iceberg. The real heavy costs are hiding just under the water. Let's walk through the math on something we all use, a refrigerator. Look at this comparison over a 5-year period. A cheap fridge has a super low upfront cost, which looks great today, but it guzzles electricity and needs frequent repairs. Now, the expensive fridge has a really high upfront cost, but it's incredibly energy efficient and pretty much never breaks down. When you do that total cost of ownership math, the slightly more expensive model actually returns way more value. It literally costs you less money overall to run it for those 5 years. If you're finding this valuable, please subscribe to Wealth Lab and share this explainer with your friends and family. It really helps us grow. Moving right along to section 4, where to actually save. Now, I want to be clear, thinking long-term does not mean you should just go out and overspend on everything. It's really about knowing exactly when buying cheap is perfectly fine and when it's a total trap. And honestly, this distinction really comes down to mindset. A cheap mindset operates from a place of scarcity. It says, oh, I can't afford that, and fixates totally on the price tag. But a frugal mindset operates from a place of empowerment. It says, I choose to save here. It's resourceful, it's highly intentional, and it's driven purely by value. There's a whole spectrum to how we spend. On one extreme, you've got the spendthrift. They're entirely focused on instant gratification, and frankly, they waste a lot of money. On the other extreme, you have the cheap person who is so fixated on the absolute lowest immediate price that they risk huge long-term costs. But right there in the middle, that's the frugal person. True frugality is a strategic marathon to build wealth. It values long-term utility. It is absolutely not a race to the bottom. So I want to leave you with one major guiding principle for the next time you buy something. Stop thinking about price and start thinking about cost per use. Just ask yourself right now, what is the most expensive, cheap thing sitting in your house right this second? Once you make this mental shift, your entire relationship with money changes for good. Thank you for joining us today. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Wealth Lab. We'll see you in the next one.